All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jorge Gaona. I'm a certified arborist and the owner of TreeNewal. I know it's the first presentation of the day, so I'm going to start off with a little video. Hopefully it'll wake everyone up a little bit. Hello, I'm Jorge Gaona, the owner of TreeNewal. We're a tree care company that specializes in treating distressed trees through a root aeration process with a patented sustained release fertilizer. We're by far the best option on the market for treating your distressed tree.
Over the years, I've used TreeNewal at my Sandlin Manor project, at my High Point Estates project in Southlake, and I used them at my Estes Park subdivision in Southlake, where we had this similar situation. We commenced development with a lot of tractors, with a lot of people. The trees went into some stress, and it was an amazing thing. These trees that maybe 10 years ago you would have removed, cut down, you would have thought they were gone. We used your process, and a year later, the trees are thriving.
This company, being an entrepreneur and creating it was an opportunity where I could channel that passion for, being green, for, giving back to the earth around us and the world around us in a positive way, but while also solving problems of customers, and helps protect their investments, helps make their homes, their businesses, their developments, their construction sites more beautiful, more lasting, more sustainable. And that's really where I got my passion for TreeNewal and the customer relationship, and providing them a great service and can turn around a tree that's struggling, a tree that was distressed from various reasons, while also simultaneously giving back to the world around us. And for every tree we fertilize, we donate one being planted at a national park. Alright, so I'm very passionate about sustainability. We started by treating trees on construction sites, but today we're going to be talking about soil compaction and the negative effect that it has on trees. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so today's objectives, we're really going to define soil compaction and understand what it is and what impact it has on soil. We're going to discuss that impact on the root systems and specifically the soil, and then also what you can do to prevent it and the negative impact that it has. So the first thing is understanding what soil compaction is. It's pretty, seems straightforward. Typically happens during new construction, hardscaping, and landscape modifications. Most of the people here are either contractors, landscape architects, or tree people like myself. So what exactly does it do whenever you compact the soil? The first thing is that it reduces your airspace, deprives the soil of oxygen, and then it makes the tree roots unable to absorb water. So those are three pretty specific negative impacts, but we'll dive into it a little bit more. So when we're looking at some of the main causes of compaction, things as simple as foot traffic, irrigation over time, just weather in general adds to the compaction of the soil. As we can see from the diagram, there's actually several steps up though. So whenever your contractors are parking the truck underneath a tree, they're technically compacting the soil. We can move up to bobcats and large excavation equipment, and you can see where the PSI increases. And then finally we have trucks such as pump trucks, concrete trucks, and other large pieces of equipment that will add PSI to the soil. Compaction severity is directly related to the force applied to the soil, how often that force is applied, and then also the characteristics of the soil. So many of y'all are probably familiar with DFW soil. We have a very high clay content. That means that the clay particles are one of the smallest soil particles that exist. It makes it very easy to compact, and this actually brings a whole bunch of other issues, drainage issues. We already discussed the airspace and the water restriction. But all of these things, what we've actually noticed on construction sites and developments is that the majority of the trees that will actually go under stress are going to be typipally in the front yard, so wherever you have access to. So if you're constructing a house or a building, most of the trees that are in the front are going to be more negatively impacted than the trees in the back. It's pretty simple, but it makes sense. So when we look at soil, there's 4 major categories of the soil. An ideal soil, and not what we have here in DFW, but an ideal soil has a pore space, which the pore space is the air and the water capacity, or the open areas of the soil. An ideal soil has 50% pore space, so you have 25% air, 5% organic matter, 25% water, and 45% minerals. Now, this is just a diagram to break it up. Obviously, a soil is much more heterogeneous and is completely mixed up, so this is just a diagram to kind of show you how the proportions of the soil are split up, but this is an ideal soil. So whenever we look at how compaction actually affects the health of the tree, there are several specific and scientific negative impacts. So as I stated, compaction reduces the pore space around the root system, so that's going to be the air space and then the water space. It has the potential to drop the root growth to 0. Obviously, the more compaction is going to have a larger impact on the amount of roots that are able to grow. Whenever we're looking at tree biology, 90% of your roots for a mature tree are going to be in the top 18 inches of soil. So many people think that a tree is an exact mirror image of the canopy. That's actually not true. Most of the roots are fairly shallow. So whenever we're constructing, whenever we're going through our processes, we typically are impacting the top 4 to 10 inches of soil during those processes, and that's going to be a vast majority of the roots on the large mature trees that we have in the area. So whenever we continue to dive into the problems, here are some of the specific impacts on the tree biology. We have short stunted roots, a decrease of the availability of water to the roots. There's limited air filtration, and this causes higher carbon dioxide levels. And then we have an increased structure impact because of this. And then, lastly is going to be the drought tolerance. Now, we're specifically talking about, compaction and the impact that it has on roots, but construction has a multitude of other negative impacts, and then there's also environmental impacts. This past year is a really good example to think about some of the other environmental impacts. Over the summertime here in DFW, we had 1 to 2 inches of rain for the full summer. If we fast forward to September, October, November, there was a deluge of water. We had about 35 or 40 inches over a 2-month period. And the reason I bring this up is because moisture and saturated soils compact far more aggressively than a dry soil does. So we have to think about these things when we're looking at soil compaction. And then a saturated soil, it's always worse to overwater a tree than it is to underwater a tree. Whenever a tree is overwatered, it really is going to prevent the ability for those roots to function, and that's just going to compound with the issues that we've been discussing. So why is prevention important? These are kind of big picture benefits. So, higher property values is probably the most important realistically. There are some, I would say altruistic or existential impacts as well, like cleaner air. There's lower power bills, better health. We're gonna have more economically robust communities. And then also it reduces the heat island effect. And here in DFW, this is a fact from the Texas Tree Foundation. In Dallas County, if there were no trees, the temperature would be 20 degrees warmer Fahrenheit, and that's because of the heat retention of concrete in buildings. So whenever you think about trees, you can think about it on the specific project and how that's going to add value, or how you're going to add structures around it to be part of the landscape design. But really, there is a bigger picture of the impact of trees. So 20 degrees Fahrenheit, it's already hot as heck in Texas. I don't want it to be any hotter. Now, if we're looking, the main way that we can counteract compaction is really going to be prevention. The reason that this is so is because once a soil is degraded, once you've gone in and you've compacted it, or if you have painters on a job site who wash their paintbrushes out underneath the tree, it's much more costly and expensive to amend a soil and to fix it once it's been compacted or it's been degraded. So trees are very similar to humans. We are most able to be impacted by negative environmental or physical impediments whenever we're young and whenever we're very old. So you can think of it as a parabola. We're weakest when we're young and we're weakest when we're old, and that's the exact same way the trees are. So that really has two main causes or impacts. One is if you have an existing tree on a job site, and if it's a very mature tree, it's going to respond in a worse way than if you had a smaller tree. And then the other thing is going to be for newly planted trees. Whenever we're talking about all this compaction, I see it every single day that I'm out on consultations. You're really supposed to dig the hole twice as big as the root ball. You're supposed to add a 20% compost amendment. We do root stimulators and a light fertilization. The average lifespan, and this is a fact that I got at actually last year's show, but the average lifespan for a tree in a suburban or urban environment is 5 to 7 years. Trees are supposed to live a heck of a lot longer than 5 to 7 years. So part of the issue is the compaction, and it ends up causing girdling roots where the roots actually circle in the hole. The idea is that a tree in the first 2 years is still going through transplantation shock, and the soil around it has been compacted through the whole process of construction. Landscape is typically one of the last things that goes in, and then you expect that tree that's in a weakened state to be able to penetrate into the soil around it. This is why we have so many, dead or dying trees whenever they're first planted. So whenever it comes to preservation, it really, the main way that we can do it, and I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with it, but are through tree protection zones. The whole point of the tree protection zone is to protect the critical root zone. Now, Dallas County actually has a different critical root zone guideline than this. The ISA standards is to measure the diameter of the tree, and then you multiply that by 1 foot. So if you have a 20-inch diameter tree, you're looking at a 20-foot critical root zone. More or less, the critical root zone is the area that's underneath the canopy. The drip line, if you were to imagine drawing a circle around the canopy, that is the drip line. And whenever we're talking about specimen trees, older trees, this is going to be the most important area to protect. Especially if you're trying to integrate with a design, a large mature tree, because who wants to design a property or a project with a large specimen tree as a focal point, and then a couple years later that tree dies. For mature trees, the impact of construction can actually be seen up to 7 to 10 years later. So trees are actually on a much different time scale than we are. If you go and cut the roots, or if you compact the soil, it might not be that first or second year that the tree starts to begin to struggle, but it will be a slow decline from that point. And one of the things we need to do is be good stewards. And so if the design includes a mature tree, you don't want that tree to be dying in 5 years, even though you'll be out of the picture at that point. There still is going to be people who are using that space. So for Dallas, the critical root zone is just defined as the drip line. That's the minimum requirement as far as protecting the tree's critical root zone. But the further that you can stay away from a tree, the root zone is going to be the more effective way at protecting it. And then for the people who are from Texas and who are familiar with post oak trees, there's a wide variety of tree species and groupings, and they all have different tolerances or resiliencies to root disturbances. I've heard over 10 home builders say that if you breathe on a post oak's roots, you'll kill it. That's actually how we started, was treating post oak trees, and the reason post oaks have such weak roots is that very quickly from the root flare, as the tree enters the ground, the diameter of the roots becomes fairly small fairly quickly. Whenever other trees have more robust root systems, the post oaks is relatively shallow and the roots are relatively thin diameter. So that's the biological reason why post oaks are so sensitive. So as I kind of stated just a second ago, reducing damage is always, it's almost impossible to prevent damage unless you stay out of the critical root zone. So there are techniques to reduce compaction, but you can't prevent it unless you stay out of that critical root zone or the tree protection zone. And then so, given you construct around a tree, you compact the soil around it, it typically takes a good amount of time before that tree is going to reclaim its health. There are treatments, there are soil conditioners, there are ways to help amend the degraded soils that have been compacted, but typically that's something that's going to be costly and it's going to take several years. It's much easier to come in and bulldoze and compact soil and ruin it than it is to fix the soil. So a proactive approach with a preventative mindset is going to be the key to preventing this damage. And then over time you can fertilize, maintain it. If you have dead portions of the tree, they do need to be pruned. Dead limbs, tip dieback, that's the easiest place for fungus, insects, and disease to enter your tree. You have to kind of think of it like a cancer patient, and my family's been impacted by that, but you don't want a dead or decaying portion to get into the main portions of your trunk or a specimen tree. So this is a quick overview of the price to replace a tree. So this is removal and replacing. These are fairly liberal numbers. A 12-inch diameter tree can span, in price for removal fairly significantly, but let's say on the lower end of that for $3,000 to remove a tree. 12-inch tree, as far as the caliper goes, is a very, very large tree, and the trees get exponentially more expensive from a 3-inch tree, which is the most common planted, up to a 10-inch. It increases substantially. So whenever it's all said and done, after removing a tree and replanting it with a specimen tree, you could be spending tens of thousands of dollars to replace the tree. All right, so does anyone have any questions? And if you ask a question, you get one of our sustainable hats, so I appreciate it, thank you. Yes, sir.
On the critical root zone, I've heard discussions about that the most sensitive area is right really at the drip line because it's where, the tree's closest parameter gets the rain, where the canopy itself
Sure.
shields it from rain. So is that true?
That's true, and that's why on that original diagram it has the critical root zone extended out away from the drip line. Unfortunately, we have to have a pretty good balance, and I know Phil Crone and Phil Irwin, the head arborist here in Dallas, because of construction, I won't say it's a battle, but it's a balance between preserving the trees that we have in our area and being able to construct projects and have growth and development. So you're absolutely right, and it makes sense with the drip line. That's why for arboriculture, ISA standards, and I am a certified arborist, it's further than the actual drip line, but for Dallas cities, municipalities, they have it smaller so that it's kind of that balance. Which color do you want?
Sure.
Any other questions?
I got one. What's your go-to solution to deal with the compacted soil?
Sure, so we actually have what's called the TreeNewal process. So it's a 4-step process. We aerate the soil, we fertilize the tree, we install a root stimulator, and also soil conditioners. So with those things and focusing on the critical root zone, we're able to help trees reclaim their health. We have a ton of before and after pictures, more than any other tree care company that I've ever seen. And we've had great success. Cosmakis with Hat Creek Estates, we treated trees on about 4 or 5 of his developments, where I'm talking about 20, 30, 40 post oak trees. By doing those things, we're able to amend the soil, help the tree, get through those processes. There's vertical mulching, you can add compost. There's a whole plethora of things, but it really comes down to, feasibility, the economics behind the budget, and what the goals are of the project and the homeowners or the business owners and everything else. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, is that aeration process a drilling process?
So in that video, we actually have a couple different ways that we do it, but there's air spading, where it's actually an air compressor where we can expose the root flare and come in and aerate the root system. We actually used a pretty unique way over the last couple years using a hydrojet, where we create auger holes but using high pressure water so that you don't get that glazing on the inside of the hole. It's the same with spading. Whenever you spade a tree, you really have to be careful. You're supposed to come and break up those walls, because whenever you spade it, it actually glazes that outside wall. And like we were talking about the compaction, that's just going to add to that negative ability for the roots to extend through it. So there's a couple different ways. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What's your position on spacing trees?
Yeah, I disagree with a lot of municipalities and homeowner associations as far as putting trees in like the 3-foot, little medians. We see live oaks and red oaks that are, 6 feet apart. It's completely not sustainable, and I'll gladly help them remove the trees, in a couple years. But really, there needs to be forethought planning, just like we're talking about preventing the damage to a specimen tree. You really need to think 5, 10, 15 years in the future and what that is going to mean for the trees and the landscape, the project. Does that answer your question?
Is there,
I would say it's all dependent on the species and the location, and that's the first part about planting a tree, is understanding the location and then what tree you're going to be planting there. So like a red oak is a pretty fast growing tree that will eventually get huge. A live oak is a more slow growing tree. So even that variance can help go into the planting process. It's extremely important though to have an understanding of the biology and the future growth and what the goals are, what the watering conditions are, etc. There's tons of things. I only talked about compaction, but there's literally hours of things that we could talk about in regards to planting trees and taking care of trees properly. Thank you, sir. And I'll get y'all hats in just a second. I have one more. Yes, ma'am.
What are your recommendations on removal of unwanted vegetation under the protected root zone after you're ready to
Sure. That's a great question. It all depends on what the goal is. Are you talking about like a residential or like a commercial area that's going to have, like, is it sod that you're trying to put underneath it or what?
Let's say you have invasive species underneath there, like dust troughs, their roots
Sure.
are getting integrated with the trees roots.
Yeah, you'd want to be really careful. We sometimes use herbicides to get rid of stuff like that. You want to make sure it's not going to kill any broadleaf. So, I mean, there's definitely research that needs to, depending on what you're talking about and what tree you're talking about. Obviously, there's mechanical removal. Typically, there's going to be a pretty thin little layer above that you could scarify and remove. You just have to be careful with who ends up doing that because, y'all are landscape architects here. Hopefully now y'all know about tree compaction and the impact, but you might have a project manager who's on a project, and then they have a landscape foreman, and then who's actually going to be removing that brush. It doesn't take very many leaps to have someone who doesn't know what they're doing and sees a root or sees plants underneath and ends up doing something that's improper. A question like that, it's all really dependent on what's going on, but I mean, there's several things that can be done. Does that answer your question enough? Sort of. All right, any other questions? I'm out of hats though, so yes, sir.
Gripping the area.
All right, hey, thank you everyone. I have a booth right through that wall behind us. So if you want to talk more about trees or if you have any questions or concerns or anything, please come in. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Anyway, it's just the gripping area because you can do superficial work, but then you really want to be sure that you grow that.